All right, everyone. I know everyone's still trickling in and signing in here, but we'll go ahead and get started here this morning. Good morning. My name is Brooke Butari, and I am the Executive Director of Alumni Relations for the American College of Financial Services. I am so proud to welcome you to today's webcast, our first ever American College Alumni Association Knowledge and Network event. As some of you may have known, this was actually supposed to be a live event in Madison, Wisconsin, in which we had hoped for about 50 people to attend. And while we're not out on the road for a true networking event, we are just ecstatic to be joined by more than 500 alumni and guests today. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. As alumni, you are part of a vast, dynamic, and vital network that is helping so many people, especially with their concerns and personal questions through this crisis. And I thank you for staying informed and connected through the knowledge from the American College today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. If you encounter any technical issues, feel free to send us a chat, and we will certainly try to help you through that. And as questions arise, please feel free to put those into the chat, and Michael and myself and our team here will look to review, and with time permitting, we will respond to those. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Michael Finke, the professor and Frank M. Engel Chair of Economic Security Research at the American College, who will share with us today the webcast Planning for a Life in Retirement.
All right, thank you very much, Brooke. And just a little bit of background on this presentation. This is a bit different than many of the presentations that I normally give on the subject of retirement planning. I have done a lot of research with our fellow faculty member, Wade Pfau, also David Blanchett, who's an adjunct at the college, on estimating optimal retirement investment strategies for creating an income in retirement. This is not about that. This is about the research that I've done on living in retirement. And a lot of this research comes from a data set that was conducted by the University of Michigan, and it's very difficult for me as a Ohio State graduate to admit that anything useful came out of the University of Michigan, but they've been following retirees since 1994, asking very detailed questions about not just their financial lives, but also their personal lives. And I think the insight from the health and retirement study can tell us a lot about advising retirees to create a life for themselves. And not, it's not just about the money. The money is really just an input into getting the most out of retirement. And so today we're going to talk about what makes people happy in retirement and how you should think about planning for a life in retirement. So at the very beginning, let's have a fun exercise. Memorize this list of words: clock, army, rock, sword, desk, bank, apple, worm, cat, baby. Got it? Now, the first part of the retirement planning process is to think a little bit about how long it's actually going to last. So how long are you going to live? How long do you need to plan for in retirement? And the answer is that nobody knows. And that's what makes the retirement planning process, especially the income planning process, so challenging, is that we don't know how long this life stage is going to last. But I'm going to present some evidence that suggests that it may last longer than we think. Life expectancy for 65-year-olds in the United States has been increasing by about a year every decade. And it's been happening throughout the 20th century in the United States and into the 21st century. We've been making significant gains in longevity after the age of 65. It used to be thought that Americans were only going to be gaining longevity at birth, and we've seen some pullback in terms of longevity, average longevity in the United States, but after the age of 65, it continues to go up by about a year every decade. The blue line is men. The red line is women. And it's commonly believed that in an opposite sex couple, the wife is going to consistently outlive the husband. But what's been happening in the United States is that men have been gaining in terms of longevity. If you look at maybe the late 1970s, early 1980s, there was a 4-year difference in longevity after the age of 65 between men and women. And if you look at where it is right now, it's about 2 years. And in fact, that is about the historical average. And really what happened in the United States is that men behaved badly back in the Mad Men era. So they smoked at a much higher rate than women. They didn't take care of themselves. But men have been taking better care of themselves. And I'll show you in the next slide that it is specific men who have done a better job of taking care of themselves and have been pushing up that longevity. And what this means is that a concept known as joint longevity is changing. What does joint longevity mean? Joint longevity is the probability that one member of a couple is still going to be alive at a given age. And because men are doing such a great job of living better, they're exercising, they're getting up in the morning and they're having their kale smoothie. They're living longer, and that's a wonderful thing because they're enjoying more years of retirement, but also that means that they're pushing out longevity, which means that you need to plan for a longer retirement. And I think it's very common to talk to people and they will look at their parents when they estimate about how long they're going to live in retirement. But that's not reasonable because our parents live differently than we do today. If you look at the statistics on longevity by income level, this is the amount of income people earned according to Social Security records. Those who are in the top 10th percentile have gained the most in terms of longevity after the age of 65. And what we see is that men in particular who have earned more money during their lifetime have gained the most in terms of longevity, and men in the top 10th percentile have gained 6 years over the last 20-year period. And that's a remarkable social phenomenon that men, especially higher income men, have gained so much in terms of longevity. So men in the top decile have gained 6 years of longevity. Women have also gained in terms of longevity that earn more money. When I give this presentation and I present the prior slide that shows that the gap between men and women in terms of longevity is narrowing, many people guess that it's because women have gone back to the workforce and they're more stressed out and they're not living as long. Well, in fact, the exact opposite is happening. Women who make more money during their lifetime are making the biggest gains in longevity. And again, that's good news that and when we look at the data to see why it is that people are living longer, so much of this is really related to behavior, that people are making investments in themselves in order to live longer. They're eating a healthier diet. And eating a healthier diet is an investment. What is an investment? An investment is living a little bit worse today. It's choosing the salad instead of the hamburger so that we can live better and longer in the future. And what we see is that these higher income Americans tend to be consistently making these investments in their health that cause them to, again, live longer. But what this also means is that they're pushing out the likelihood that they're going to live into their 90s. In fact, if you look at the mortality tables, and I think, I spend a lot of time looking at mortality tables because I do a lot of estimates of the value of annuitization and different types of financial products that involve the use of mortality tables. Social Security mortality tables are not relevant for most financial planning clients. Why? Because people don't live as long on average in the United States that are in some of those lower income brackets. In the higher income brackets, people tend to live much longer. So among those who are in the healthiest category of Americans, and these are the type of people who buy annuities, if you look at the Society of Actuaries annuity table, what you see is that there's about a 43% chance that one spouse is going to live to the age of 95. And if you think about the original 4% rule, it was based on the idea that nobody was going to live beyond the age of 95. It judged the safety of the 4% rule based on whether the money lasted to the age of 95. But in reality, among healthy couples, there's a 43% chance that one of them is going to live beyond the age of 95, which means that we need to push that planning horizon further back. And in 15 years, that's probably going to make its way up to about 50%. What is your goal in retirement? If you've worked your whole life and you've stopped working, then your life is really about getting the most out of the resources and the time that you have in retirement. So what I did in this research is I looked at this wonderful group of variables that exist in the health and retirement study that are meant to assess satisfaction with life. And what we're going to do is we're going to predict what actually makes people more satisfied in retirement. And the question I very often get is, does money actually make you happy in retirement? Is it worth it to save during your working years so that you have more money available? Does it really make a difference in retirement? And the answer, which I think is going to be gratifying to those of us who are savers, is yes. The more money we have, the more life satisfaction we have in retirement. And it tends to go up at a roughly linear rate up into about $4.5 million. And at that point, it seems to trail off a bit, but that's enough. If you have $4.5 million, you have more than you'll ever be able to spend in retirement. That is sufficient. And at that point, it seems to trail off. But yes, money does seem to make you happier in retirement. Now, why is that interesting? Why is it even a little bit surprising? Well, among some social scientists, there is this idea that income above a certain level doesn't really make you that much happier. In fact, when I was at Texas Tech University, I had a friend who was a sociologist, and he said, well, Michael, over an income of about $70,000, money doesn't really make you happier. So you spend too much time studying this stuff. To which I said, well, we can actually test this. You make more than $70,000. Why don't you write me a check for $1,000, and we can see whether or not it's going to make me happier and you less happy, because your hypothesis is that it's not going to make you any less happy. And he never wrote me the check, so we were never able to test that hypothesis. But my hypothesis is that I would have been a little bit happier with that check than without it. People who have more money are happier. So how do people spend money in retirement? What we find is that people spend almost the exact same amount the year after they retire that they did the year before they retired. So on the median is almost a 0% change. Now, why is that? Well, we're creatures of habit. We go to the same grocery store. We live in the same house. We pay the same property taxes. We pay the same insurance. We tend to spend about the same. Now, there is some variation in spending. I have a friend who works for JP Morgan Chase, and she has access to people's credit card statements and their bank account statements. She finds the exact same thing that I find using these data, but what she also finds is that some people go a little bit crazy in retirement. I call them the RV retirees, the ones that end up spending a few $100,000 on an RV at the very beginning of retirement because they think that that's going to make them happy. It's what they saved all this money for. And about RVs, I have a story that I tell about a financial planner that I've known for a long time. And if he had a client who came to him and said, I think I'm going to buy an RV when I retire, he would say, that's a fantastic idea. You're going to have a great time. You're going to get to see the country. And I know of a company that'll rent you a mid-size RV for a month. And we can decide after that if you want to get a big RV or if you want to get a smaller one, because I find that some of my clients, they really like to have the space. Other of my clients, they like to have a more nimble RV that's easier to drive around. So why don't you just rent a mid-size one for a month? And the reason that he gave that advice was not to see whether or not his client wanted a big RV or a small RV. He did it because he knew about 2/3 of his clients were going to come back after a month in an RV, and they were going to never want to get in an RV again, because for them, it wasn't that enjoyable. It was almost like a job. They were like a truck driver. And who wants to retire a job in order to be a truck driver? But for the other third of retirees, they got a kick out of living in an RV. And so they wanted to go ahead and buy an RV at that point. And for them, it made perfect sense. And much of the results that I'm going to show in some of these future slides is related to this reason why buying an RV early in retirement makes sense for some people and doesn't make sense for other people. And the reason is because for some people, it enhances opportunities for social interaction. And for other retirees, it isolates them from other human beings. And depending on what type of RV driver you are, that will determine whether or not you actually enjoy buying an RV in retirement or a vacation home. So the key to life satisfaction in retirement, there's a number of different inputs, but really the bottom line is social interaction. How much do people spend of their pre-retirement income? Commonly in financial planning, what we see is that advisors recommend that you replace 70% of your income, when in fact, people are not spending 70% of their gross income before they retire. And after they retire, they tend to spend about the same as that amount. But if you actually look at how much people are actually spending as a percentage of their pre-retirement gross income, for most higher income groups, it's about 50% to 60%. So that really should be the replacement rate. You're trying to replace the lifestyle that you had before retirement. The first year of retirement, this is what the replacement rate needs to be at different levels of income. But what we also see is that spending goes down in retirement. So this was a study that was done a few years ago. Subsequent studies, including studies by David Blanchett, who, as I mentioned, is an adjunct at the college, show that spending tends to decline as you get older. And what we see is that it's not just among moderate income Americans, but also among the most wealthy Americans. We actually see a sharper decline in spending among people who have enough money to spend on whatever they want in retirement. And so we've done a number of subsequent studies to look more closely into this, but it does seem like the spending path declines in retirement. And very often what happens is people spend the most money between the ages of 65 and 70, and you see some of these sharpest declines in spending during the mid 70s. So people get all that traveling out of the way early on in retirement, and then they build a routine in retirement. And then what we see in people's 80s is that they tend to spend more money on things like healthcare. But that actually replaces spending on some other categories, because as you get less healthy, you also spend money on less money on other things. What type of spending contributes the most to overall life satisfaction? The one category that stands out above all others is leisure spending. What constitutes leisure spending? Well, this is spending on things like eating out or going on vacations, or buying tickets to a show. This is the spending that really makes people happy in retirement. And surprisingly, some of these other categories that have shown up in the prior literature are really not statistically significant when you control for all the other different factors that can contribute to life satisfaction. So you may have seen that gifts, for example, contribute to life satisfaction, but it also happens to be that people who have more money and more wealth give more gifts. And that means that once you control for things like income and wealth, that gift variable actually doesn't end up being statistically significant. It is the leisure spending that makes people happier. And I'm going to note here for a moment that cars are not statistically significant, but they're almost statistically significant. And what I tell people is, I give you, especially males, I give you license to go out and buy a fun car in retirement. And the reason is because a fun car is likely to open up opportunities for social interaction. And men in particular are vulnerable to social isolation in retirement. Very often, women are doing a better job of building a social network outside of the workforce. Men have a more difficult time building and maintaining a social network outside of the workforce. So when they leave their job, what very often happens is that men lose that social network. And buying a car can be a way of reestablishing a social network. But think about things like this when you're thinking about how to spend money in retirement, that it is very often those more social spending categories that lead to greater satisfaction. That's what you should be focusing your spending on. What are some trends that are going on in income in retirement? The blue line here is the amount of money that we were making from our labor income before retirement. The green line represents the amount of money that we're receiving from all guaranteed income sources, including things like Social Security and pensions. And what we see is that this trend, by the way, has continued after 2008, that the gap between the amount of money people are making after retirement from all guaranteed income sources and the amount that they were making before retirement, and especially these younger baby boomers or the baby boomers who are about to retire right now, there's a significant gap between the amount of money they were making before retirement and the amount of money that they're making from all guaranteed income sources after retirement. So this is kind of interesting because now that we're in the defined contribution age, that means that if we're going to maintain the lifestyle that we had before retirement, we're going to have to spend down our wealth. And how many people actually feel comfortable seeing their nest egg get smaller in retirement? And most Americans say that would not make me feel comfortable at all. I don't want to spend down my money to provide a lifestyle in retirement. This is really an artifact of a different age. An economist would look at this and say, this doesn't make any sense at all, because why did you save all that money in the first place? Why didn't you just buy a bigger house? Why didn't you just go on more vacations or buy a nicer car? You socked all this money away for retirement, and then you get to retirement and you don't feel comfortable spending that money. But the reality is that most Americans don't feel comfortable spending the money that they've saved in retirement. And I think that has some sources, some emotional sources that are very difficult for those of us who are savers to counteract. I did a separate study where I looked at retirees who had done a great job over their lifetime of setting aside enough money for retirement. They spent significantly less than their income, especially right before retirement, and we called them the ants. And this is from the parable of the ant and the grasshopper. The ant saves for the winter, the grasshopper dances the summer away. By the time the winter comes, the ant has plenty of food and the grasshopper is hungry. And that parable is supposed to remind people that it's good to save for the future. It's good to spend less than your income. It's good to develop this habit of thrift. And most ants have developed this habit of thrift. And what that means is that they've gotten used to spending significantly less than their income. They feel good about the fact that they're spending less than their income. The grasshoppers, on the other hand, are people who haven't developed the same habit of thrift. They were spending more before retirement, but what we try to do is we try to match them up by the same level of income and the same level of wealth. So the grasshoppers may have gotten their wealth because they sold a business, or maybe they inherited some of their wealth, but they hadn't developed the same habit of thrift as the ants did. And so when we follow the ants and grasshoppers in retirement, what we see is that ants tend to spend about $20,000 less per year in retirement. And there's a lot more variation in spending among the grasshoppers. Grasshoppers spend more. They spend, in some cases, a lot more in retirement. So the ants are not really at risk of running out of money in retirement. But the grasshoppers are more at risk of running out of money in retirement. You can identify who is an ant and who is a grasshopper before retirement, and then plan for spending in retirement based on those tendencies to either spend too little or spend too much. I also looked at what happens when a grasshopper and ant receive an inheritance. And what I find is that for every $1,000 a grasshopper gets an inheritance, they spend an extra $267 per year. And that means that if you give money, if you pass on money to a child, for example, who is a grasshopper, they will spend that money on average in about 4 years, a little less than 4 years. So all that money that you didn't have fun with, because you didn't spend it in retirement, if you have a child who is a grasshopper, they will in fact have fun with that money and it will be gone in less than 4 years. If you have a child who is an ant, on the other hand, for every $1,000 that they get in a windfall, like an inheritance, they spend an extra $4. So with interest, it's probably going to take them about 400 or 500 years to spend down any inheritance that they receive, which means that if you give money to an ant, they're probably just going to pass it on to the next generation. And it'll just keep getting passed on until grasshoppers get a hold of it and actually spend the money down. Now, if you look at financial services advertisements on what people actually do in retirement, what's supposed to motivate them to save for retirement, what you see is a lot of lying on the beach. In fact, I have a collection of photographs, which is just couples taken from behind, staring at the ocean, lying on a beach. So apparently this is what we're supposed to do in retirement, is we're supposed to sit in our beach chairs and just stare at the ocean all day long. And in fact, I have literally 60 or 70 photographs which are the exact same thing, couple sitting in a beach chair. And the reality is that the number one activity, if we actually look at what people do, there is time use data in the health and retirement study. The number one activity in retirement is sleep. The number two activity is watching television. So if these photographs were actually realistic, the couple would be sitting on a couch in their living room, they would have a remote in their hands, and they would be changing the channel on their TV set, because that's what people spend the most time doing in retirement. But we're supposed to imagine that this is going to be our life in retirement. But again, the reality is that once you get on the beach, how exciting is that for 2 weeks in a row, or a month, or 2 months? I did a panel once with a group of retirees, and one of them had retired at the age of 55. She'd sold her law firm, and she bought a beach house in Mexico. And she lasted about 6 weeks before she got bored and moved back home. So I think it's important to be realistic about what a lifestyle actually looks like in retirement, because it may not look like the way we imagine, or at least the way that financial services companies imagine retirement to look like. What are the predictors of happiness in retirement? I often say that there are 3 pillars of happiness in retirement, 3 consistent predictors of life satisfaction. And the first predictor of life satisfaction is health. And there's one consistency among all these predictors of life satisfaction in retirement, and that is that they all require an investment. And an investment in health is, as I mentioned before, eating better or exercising more so that we can have a higher likelihood of being in good health in retirement. And that's an input into life satisfaction. If we have plenty of money but we don't have health, we're not going to be that happy in retirement. So health is one of the 3 pillars of life satisfaction in retirement. The second pillar of life satisfaction is relationships and the quality of your relationships. In general, married people are happier than unmarried retirees. Widowed retirees are significantly less happy. And this creates also a motivation for the purchase of life insurance. It's not just about replacing a spouse's earning ability. It's also about replacing the satisfaction that you got from being in a couple in retirement. As I mentioned before, money can provide greater satisfaction in retirement. So the receipt of life insurance can actually open up avenues for you to try to make up for some of the loss in life satisfaction of losing your partner. You can go on cruises, you can travel more, you can go out with friends. So losing your spouse is a big negative source of life satisfaction. Being in a close relationship with your spouse is an incredibly big source of life satisfaction in retirement, and something also to bear in mind when you're planning for a life in retirement. Because if you haven't done a good enough job of maintaining the quality of that relationship, what you'll find is that could have an adverse impact on your life satisfaction in retirement. Those who have a spouse that is working are significantly less happy in retirement. And that also speaks to this idea of coordinating retirement, because the presence of your spouse has such a big impact on life satisfaction in retirement. When one spouse decides to retire and the other spouse is still working, that can create a certain amount of resentment, because you're not able to draw a source of life satisfaction from that spouse. Now, there's been a lot of really interesting new research on the science of friendship and the benefits of social interaction. Um, and there's a great study that was done a couple years ago that really pointed to the fact that friendship and maintaining a friendship is costly. It takes time. It takes effort. They describe it as an investment and cognitive mechanisms. Well, that means that we may have a long-term friendship. Our friend lives in a different city, but it's going to take maintaining phone calls and texts and occasionally flying up to visit them to maintain that relationship over time. It's an investment, just like investment in health. All of these social interactions are also an investment. They require a little bit of a sacrifice to be able to maintain over time. But what we find is that in retirement, those who have maintained those close relationships can then draw from those relationships and be more satisfied in retirement. There's a fascinating literature on the biology of why we as human beings are programmed to get so much enjoyment from social interaction. And it really comes down to the fact that one of our biggest sources of success as a species is our ability to act collectively as a group. And other types of primates who are very similar to us in terms of social structure, they get the same positive feelings, endorphins, from enhancing those social interactions. In fact, when baboons groom each other, it highlights the same part of, or lights up the same part of our brain that is lit up in human beings when we laugh and tell jokes with friends. It's our body's way of telling us you're doing a good thing by enhancing those social interactions, by maintaining those social relationships that we can then draw from. And it helps us as a species to be able to draw from those closer relationships. So when we actually run what we call a multivariate analysis, and we look at the predictors, the social interaction predictors of happiness and retirement, what we see is that relationship that we have with our spouse is really the primary driver of satisfaction in retirement. But contact with friends is also a significant predictor of the amount of happiness that we get in retirement. Maintaining those close friendships is another great and important source of life satisfaction. I think it's also important in this slide to point out the coefficients on children, because I think if your motivation for having children was that they were going to make you happier in retirement, we really don't see a whole lot of evidence of that happening. There are, people who have children are slightly happier, but it's not statistically significant. So your kids are not really a primary source of satisfaction in retirement. It's something that I like warning people about a little bit, because so many couples try to coordinate their retirement around their children. But you have to recognize that it's really your friends and your spouse that are the primary source of those social interactions in retirement. One final note on children. We do find that having kids makes you a little bit happier, although it's not statistically significant. But living within 10 miles of your children has a significant effect, but it's negative. So if your plan in retirement is to move close to your children, and you have this idea about what the relationship is going to be like in retirement, that idea may not match up with reality. Very often what happens is, there may be one spouse that wants to live close to the kids a little bit more than the other spouse, and then they get there and they end up being cheap babysitters, and they don't listen to your wonderful advice. And some of these relationship dynamics that were not that bad when you didn't see each other as frequently become more of an issue when you see each other more frequently. Something at least to be aware of. There's not a whole lot of evidence that living close to your children is actually going to make you happier. One thing that does seem to happen consistently in retirement is that you tend to lose your social network. This was a study that was done in Europe that hypothesized that maybe people who retired a little bit later did a better job of maintaining their social network. And the answer was that they didn't. Everybody seems to lose their social network after retirement. And that's because I think a big chunk of our social network is related to our work. And those relationships tend to fade over time in retirement. This was a study that was done by a friend of mine when I was at Texas Tech University, where he was looking at how different types of housing environments affected your life satisfaction in retirement. And what he found was that people who lived in their own home were consistently happier throughout their life cycle until they hit their 80s. But once they hit their 80s, they became less mobile. And they, as I will also talk about, they also experience some cognitive challenges that make it far easier to maintain social relationships living in a collective type of environment as opposed to living by themselves. It's very easy to become socially isolated in your 80s and 90s. And one of the things that I very often recommend is that advisors talk to their clients about making that transition into a different type of a living environment in their 80s, but plan for it at the beginning of retirement, because it can be very challenging when you are in your mid 80s and you're experiencing some of these issues, and you may not be aware of the fact that you're experiencing these issues and become increasingly socially isolated. You may end up having to have your kids move you into a different type of living environment. There's all sorts of issues that are associated with that. I think it's better to figure out where you want to move to in your 80s and then create a plan to transition into a different type of living environment as you get older. And one of the reasons why it's important to think about transitioning to a different type of living environment is that we do experience consistent physical changes as we get older. And I think part of planning for retirement is becoming aware that we have to plan for physical and cognitive decline as part of the aging process. This is one of my favorite slides, which is the healthiest people on the planet. What is their average half marathon time by age? And what we see is that your half marathon times consistently get worse, especially as you hit your 70s and 80s and 90s. So we're all going to, even the people who run every day are going to experience some type of physical decline as they get older. And most of our physical systems see about 1 to 2 percentage point annual decline in performance. And medical technology, this is an example of an artificial hip. We can mediate some of this decline through medical technology, but in general, what happens is that our physical systems decline at a rate of about 1 to 2 percentage points per year. Now, our brains experience the same type of decline that the rest of our bodies experience. And let me take a moment and talk about intelligence theory. So our brains are like a processor and a hard drive. And the processor part of our brain is the part that takes a visual stimulus and immediately processes it. And that part of our brain peaks in our mid-20s. So that's a little bit depressing for those of us who think that we're on the mental decline after our mid-20s. But the fact is that if you're in a profession that requires raw processing ability, so if you're a mathematician, you better do it in your mid-20s because you're not going to be able to do it later on in life. Einstein had his magic year when he was 26. If you're a race car driver, you're probably going to peak somewhere in your late 20s, because race car driving is all about spatial recognition and reacting very quickly to visual stimuli. That peaks in your mid-20s. Now, thankfully, most of us are in jobs that don't just require processing ability. They also require a hard drive. We get education at the American college. We learn about how, different types of techniques, and we store all that in our hard drive. And we can be better at our jobs the more stuff we have stored in our hard drive. But what ends up happening is that we continue to experience that decline in processing ability, and even our decisions that require the hard drive will end up peaking, and they usually peak in the mid-50s or so, and then you start seeing a gradual decline through your 60s and 70s, but particularly in your 80s and 90s, you start seeing a significant decline in actual cognitive performance. By the way, how many of those 10 words from the beginning of the presentation can you remember? And I am very bad at this stuff, I will admit. You know, the trick is, by the way, to create a visual image of all those 10 things in one picture. So you have a baby who's sitting on a desk, who's holding an apple, and the apple has a worm in it. That's how you remember. So those are mnemonic devices. But most of us have trouble with this kind of stuff, and especially as we get older. This is what's known as episodic memory. It's a combination of immediate and delayed word recall. And in the health and retirement study, they do this test. So they give people a list of words, and then they ask them to name as many words as they can remember immediately. And then halfway through the test, they ask them again, how many words do you remember? And that's delayed word recall. And the average of that is this black line. And it tends to decline at a roughly linear rate in old age. You see the same thing when it comes to numeracy. In this case, can people answer the question, if five people have to share a $2 million prize, how much does each person get? So you're basically dividing 20 by 5, and the fraction of people who can get that correct declines at that same linear rate in old age. I think it's also interesting to note that only about half of Americans can divide 20 by 5, even in their 50s. This was a study that we did a few years ago, which was the largest financial literacy study that anybody has ever conducted. And what we found was that there is that same decline in financial literacy as there is in numeracy and word recall. So our ability to make basic financial decisions declines at a roughly linear rate as we get older. But the red line is our confidence in our ability to make financial decisions. And what we see is that the confidence in our ability to make financial decisions does not actually go down at all. In fact, it goes up a little bit. And this is very comparable to driving and driving skill. So driving, our ability to drive a car declines at a roughly 1 to 2 percentage points per year, but our awareness of that decline is not very good. So, you know, oftentimes when we drive with someone who's 90 years old, we might sit in the passenger seat, and after a couple of blocks, we realize that we're sitting in the wrong seat. You lose your ability to drive as you get older, your ability to respond to stimuli. But you're not aware of it because it's happening so slowly. And this is really what happens to us in retirement, is that we lose our ability to make financial decisions, but we're not aware of it. And that can create a lot of vulnerability as we get older. Now, this is Mark Ivry, and Mark Ivry was at the Treasury Department, and he was one of the one who was responsible for the Pension Protection Act of 2006. A few years ago, Mark Ivry pushed for what's known as a qualified longevity annuity contract. And I, in fact, was at a conference with Mark this summer, and I said, every time I talk about retirement income planning, I always have a slide on QLACs, and I have a picture of you. And he said, well, that would explain why nobody buys them. So a QLAC is a type of annuity that begins making income payments later in life. And in fact, the Treasury Department with the IRS creates a tax incentive for us to buy one of these qualified longevity annuity contracts. You can put up to $135,000 of your IRA assets into a QLAC, and you don't have to pay any RMDs on that $135,000. So between the ages of 72 and whenever you start the income, and I always recommend that if people get a QLAC, they start the income as late as possible, so at the age of 85. You can create a automatic income for yourself. And as I mentioned before, 85-year-olds are not spending a huge amount of money. So you can spend $135,000 today, and you can get maybe $35,000 to $40,000 of income at the age of 85. Combine that with Social Security, and that can cover most of your expenses. And the best thing about a QLAC is that you're not having to manage pulling money out of your IRA on your own. You can automate that income process, and you can do it in a tax efficient way. So I'm a huge fan of QLACs, and I consider them a form of dementia insurance, because by the time we hit our 80s and 90s, we need to automate the income process from the money that we've saved, and it's likely that we're going to actually be happier if we do that. So the reason why QLACs are so efficient is because they buy guaranteed income later on in life when it is the least expensive. And I very often given presentations about the value of annuitization where I compare the cost of buying income from a bond ladder to buying an income where you pool mortality risk through annuitization. And I show them how much less expensive it is to buy income at various different ages. And one of the best examples is a group of 10 men. These are all healthy men who are planning on spending $100,000 per year, and they're looking at either building a bond ladder up to the age of 100. And by the way, up to the age of 100, you still have a 5% chance of outliving your money. But if you build your bond ladder up to the age of 100, you have to set aside a certain amount of money every year to fund $100,000 of spending. So the cost of funding $100,000 of spending at the age of 96 is about $40,000 given today's low interest rates. So you have to set aside $40,000 today to fund $100,000 of spending at the age of 96 if you're a 65-year-old male. Or you can get together with 9 other males who are age 65, and because you have about a 1 in 10 chance of living to the age of 96, you can create a long life income club. And instead of each of you having to save $40,000, you can pool your money together and save $4,000 each. And whoever among the 10 of you is still alive at the age of 96 gets to spend the full $100,000, and they only had to set aside $4,000 to do it. So that's the advantage of pooling your money together in a long life income club. Now, what about the other 9 men who subsidize the 10th man who is still alive? Well, they're dead, so they don't care that they subsidize the 10th man because they're not going to spend the money anyway. But when they were alive, they got to spend more money because they only set aside $4,000 to fund later life spending. They had more money available to spend early on in retirement, and they didn't have to worry about potentially running out of money. So that is the benefit of mortality pooling in retirement, which I think is very important as part of creating a plan in retirement that's actually going to lead to greater happiness. Cognitive decline. As I mentioned before, cognitive decline is an issue, especially later in life. And what we see is that response to the 2008 to 2010 financial crisis in terms of equity allocation tended to be far stronger among retirees who were experiencing cognitive decline. So many of these retirees pulled all their money out of risky assets at just the worst time in retirement. So this is actually a risk, yet another risk of cognitive decline in retirement is that you're not going to perform as well on the equity portion of your portfolio because you're going to be too tempted to pull money out during a market crash, or you're going to put too much money in when the market is going up. And we actually see that in our research, that risk aversion, people are more risk averse as they get older. But what we see is something known as time varying risk aversion. What we see is that when the markets are going up, older households tend to become more risk tolerant. But when the markets are going down, they become more risk averse. And so if we actually look at it by age group, it's not these younger investors who are pulling all the money out of the market when the market's crashing. It's in fact these older investors, or the ones who are nearest retirement in this case. So this is defined contribution savers. We see that this group is the one that's most likely to respond to whatever's going on in the marketplace and shift their money out of stocks if there's a crash, or put more money into stocks if stocks are going up. And this next slide is brand new research as of this week, and it is so incredibly exciting. We just got data from defined contribution participants, and we can see in March of 2020 who pulled their money out of stocks in their defined contribution plan. And just as we would have expected, it was participants over the age of 60 who pulled the most money out of stocks, and especially over the age of 70. And those who had a high stock allocation were far more likely to pull their money out of stocks after they had already fallen in value in March of 2020. So again, one of the risks of investing in risky assets in retirement is that we will actually not capture the benefits of stock investments because we're going to be too prone to these sort of emotion-driven trades. I'm going to end the presentation by showing some evidence that investment performance does actually decline in old age. And this was a study that was done in 2011 using actual brokerage data. And what they find is that older investors consistently underperform. And we think that one of the reasons that they underperform is because of bad market timing. And it's yet another reason as we retire to rely on someone else to help us manage our investment portfolio, lest we not be able to capture the benefits of investing in risky assets. In many cases, older investors, even if they invest in stocks, don't get the benefit of investing in stocks because they're not able to manage that portfolio over time. Now, I'm not sure if we got any questions. I'm looking in my little chat box here.
Yeah, Michael, there were some interesting questions that
Sure.
did pop up throughout the presentation, if we have a few minutes here.
We do.
One of the questions from earlier in the presentation related to joint longevity with couples, looking at same-sex couples compared to opposite couples. Have you seen any data related to that?
You know, I haven't, and I think one of the issues, especially with the HRS, is that there's not a large number of same-sex couples. And, you know, again, a lot of it is going to be determined by income and health and socioeconomic status. But my guess is that, you know, a lot of the increases in longevity that men have made over the last 20 years or so are going to show up in same-sex couples as well if they're in those higher education, higher income groups, where you're going to see joint longevity that's a lot longer than you might have otherwise expected with a couple of 65-year-old males.
Right, right. Yeah, another question that had come through was about the ants and the grasshoppers. And, you know, what happens when an ant is married to a grasshopper in retirement as far as spending and the relationship?
That is such a great question, because I think that there are a lot of issues when a ant marries a grasshopper. I had a professor, a financial planning professor that I worked with at another university, and she once told me that she maintained a balance on her credit card every month. And I was just shocked because that's like rule one in financial planning, is that if you have the money, you pay off your credit card balance. And her rationale was that her husband would, if they paid off the credit card, her husband would just spend all the remaining um, uh, value that he can spend on the credit card. So she made sure that they never paid off the credit card balance as a way of sort of managing his grasshopper instincts. And in fact, I did a bunch of interviews with retirees a couple years ago for a financial company, and in two occasions, a couple had chosen to buy an income annuity because the wife believed that the husband was not capable of managing their finances after she died. So she went ahead and made the decision to buy an income annuity because she was worried that if she didn't, her husband would spend all the money in retirement. So that's an example of how you can try to accommodate having these two different sets of preferences. But I think, as we know, you're not going to change your instinct. So if you're a grasshopper, you're a grasshopper. What you can do is you can avoid distractions or create guardrails to prevent the grasshopper from impacting the well-being of the ant too much. And by the way, there's a lot of reason to believe that grasshoppers are actually doing it right. That, you know, one of the biggest problems with ants is that they don't spend their money in retirement. In fact, when we follow ants over time, we see that they just tend to accumulate more money in retirement. And even if you ask them, are you accumulating more money because you want to give money to your kids? Very often they say, no, that's not why I'm saving my money. But I think people forget that, you know, there's really only two options. You can either spend it on yourself or you can pass it on. And if you're not spending on yourself, then you need to make some sort of an estate plan. But oftentimes what we see is the grasshoppers will spend far less than they could spend in retirement just because they built up this habit of thrift.
Very good, very good. Another question related to the expenses pre and post retirement. Was wondering if your data that you presented factored in liability expenses and Medicare expenses.
Yes, so these are all expenses in retirement. And yeah, what we see is that there is this gradual real after inflation. It's important to remember that all these numbers are after inflation. So you may be spending the same amount of money about every year, but your real after inflation spending continues to decline in retirement. Really what we see is that spending in different categories is what's changing over retirement. In retirement is that as we get older, we tend to spend more on health care, but we're spending a lot less on some of those other categories.
Hmm. Hmm. We're hearing a lot about, the data that you mentioned at the end with the stocks, and then we're also hearing a lot about annuities right now. So one of the things you touched on was the percentage of retirees who pulled the money out of stocks this past month. Is there any research around the behavior of those who allocated a portion of the portfolio to annuities during the same time period?
That is a great question. I actually don't have that data because this is just defined contribution. And I don't have any information about how much they might have in pensions. I have done research over the last year on life satisfaction among those who have annuitized income. Of course, not just annuities, but also pensions. And what we see is consistently that people, they feel like it's okay to spend the money that they're getting in every month that they know is not going to run out because that income payment is going to last for life. And it tends to have a positive and absolutely consistent impact on life satisfaction. And I think it's interesting that annuitization can help both ants and grasshoppers, because for ants, it gives you license to actually spend the money that you save for retirement. And for grasshoppers, it kind of gives you a guideline about how much money you can budget to spend every month in retirement. So for both ants and grasshoppers, it can make some sense.
Okay, okay. I think we might have time for about two more questions here then. I see one that popped through in terms of mortality credits. How do you compare and contrast SPIASs versus QLACSs to, this is my non-financial voice here, Tauntines?
Oh, tontines. Wow, this is
Tauntines, yeah.
a question. I could probably go an hour on this question. I will
Oh
just make
no,
the
oh
point
no.
that any type of income annuity that uses mortality credits, which is any kind of income annuity, especially SPIAs and DIAs. DIAs, you're really maximizing those mortality credits. One of the points that Wade Pfau very often makes is mortality credits are guaranteed. Equity performance is not guaranteed. So you only have a 30, 40-year time horizon in retirement. If you get unlucky with your equity performance, then it's very possible that you're not going to be able to spend more by investing more in equities. Whereas with mortality credits, you get them no matter what. They're a risk-free benefit that you can generate from your investment portfolio, which is why a lot of economists like Wade and I and a lot of other economists are big fans of annuitization, because it's a great way to capture the most spending from our retirement savings.
Wonderful. So I think that's all the time that we have for questions right now. Again, on behalf of the Alumni Association, we thank everyone for attending. We saw a lot of questions come in at the end related to the pandemic and people interested in research and advice. And I would strongly encourage anyone who hasn't yet signed up for the Financial Planning During a Pandemic webcast series, the 4-part series, which starts later today, to go ahead and do so on the American College's website. There's a number of different webcasts planned. They're all posted on the website, and we would also encourage you to connect with the Alumni Association. So again, we thank you for joining us today. We welcome your feedback, and we wish everyone health and safety in this time.